Halloween had always been special. It wasn't just any holiday, but the holiday. From the instant the calendar flipped to October, you could feel the town come to life in a way that it never did at any other time of year. It wasn't because of the costumes, the candy, or even the haunted houses. It was the atmosphere. That sweet spot between summer's heat and winter's chill, wherein days grew shorter and nights seemed full of mystery. Halloween was the pinnacle of my year when I was younger. It was every October, the slow-burning fuse of building excitement. I'd plan my costume months in advance, spending hours inside my head debating what would be scarier, cooler, or funnier. There was just something magical about stepping out into the cold night air, knocking on doors, and watching bags fill with candy as every house in town turned into its own spooky world. This year was no different. Practically since the end of Halloween last year, as a boy I'd been planning this one. My costume was ready, a homemade Frankenstein's monster, with stitched-together clothes, green face paint, and fake bolts screwed into my neck. I'd even practiced my walk, that slow shambling shuffle that a creature made alive by science should have. The night before Halloween, I could hardly sleep. I was up late, just lying in bed, thinking about the streets which would be lined with carved pumpkins, candles inside their hollow faces flickering. I almost tasted the candy, felt the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my feet. It was going to be perfect. But then, the next morning, I woke up, and something was wrong. Very wrong. There wasn't a Halloween. I closed my eyes tightly, thinking that maybe I was having a bad dream. Then, I threw off the coverlets and ran to the window, and my heart fell. There were no decorations, no glowing pumpkins on porches, no kids running around in costume. The streets were empty, quiet, and utterly plain, as if overnight Halloween had been scrubbed from the world. The weird thing was, it felt just like any other day. The sun shone, people were out walking their dogs, cars drove by, but none of it hinted it was Halloween. I ran downstairs in a very confused state. The house was just like the outside world, no signs of usual excitement my family always shared this time of year. Mom and Dad sat in the kitchen, sipping their coffee and chatting about work. Not one mention of Halloween. Not a single pumpkin was to be found on the table, and not one bowl of candy. It was as if it didn't exist. "Mom?" I asked, my voice uncertain. "Isn't today Halloween?" She frowned, peering up at me over her coffee. "Halloween? What are you talking about?" I stared at her, my heart racing. "Halloween. The costumes, the trick-or-treating. Remember? It's October 31st. My dad chuckled, shaking his head. "Sounds like someone had a weird dream last night. There's no such thing as Halloween." I blinked, completely thrown off. No such thing as Halloween? You have to be kidding. But the look in their faces told me they were not joking. They truly had no idea what I was talking about. My stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't right. Something was horribly wrong. I ran outside, disregarding my parents' confused looks. The streets were empty still, no kids, no decorations, nothing. I knocked on my neighbor's door, hoping they might know what was happening. Mrs. Henderson answered, an older woman who always decorated her house in the scariest way. "Mornin', dear," she said with a warm smile. "How can I help you?" "Mrs. Henderson, what happened to Halloween? There's no decoration. Nobody speaks of it. Did the town cancel it or something?" Her smile faltered, and her head cocked slightly. "Halloween? I've never heard of that, dear. Is it some sort of new holiday?" I stepped back, my heart pounding harder. How could she not know what Halloween was? She decorated her house every year. She had the best candy on the block. Yet now it was like the whole holiday had vanished from everyone's memory. I tried a few more houses, asking the same question. But every person I talked to gave me the same confused look, like they'd never heard of Halloween in their entire lives. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I felt like I was losing my mind. How could a holiday just disappear? It was like I'd lived in some kind of kooky parallel universe all day. Nobody I asked knew a thing, just looking at me as if I was inquiring into something that had never been heard of. Weirder still, the weirder it got, the more people I asked. How could no one remember Halloween? Even kids at school seemed oblivious, and I thought of asking my friends. It was as though the entire town had collectively forgotten a holiday we celebrated literally every year. The afternoon wore on, and I meandered through the town square. Usually, this would be bustling with excitement, kids showing off their costumes, last-minute shoppers grasping at candy, pumpkins lined up across every storefront. But today? Nothing. Just ordinary life with people going about their business, like it was some kind of regular day. I went to the park, looking for some sort of answer. Trees danced effortlessly with the breeze, their leaves tinging into the colors of fall. I sat on a bench and watched the world go by, trying to make some sense of it all. That was when I saw something. Across the park, near the old oak tree, a man sat on a bench staring out across the empty playground. He looked ordinary enough, except for one thing: at his feet, resting quietly, was a small orange pumpkin. The first one I had seen all day. I got up, my heart pounding, and walked over to him. The closer I came to him, the stranger he seemed. His clothes were a bit too old-fashioned, his face was pale, with circles under his eyes. Yet, it wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he sat, rigid, as if waiting for something. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking a little. "Do you know what happened to Halloween? It's just nobody seems to remember the day." The man turned his head back, slowly, and looked at me with dull and distant eyes. For a while, I thought he wouldn't talk to me at all. But then, in a low, hoarse voice, he uttered something that sent cold chills down my spine. Halloween never existed. My stomach twisted, and my mind reeled. But it does. I mean, it did. I remember it. Every year we dress up, we go trick-or-treating. There are decorations everywhere. How can you say it never existed? The man's eyes fell to the pumpkin at his feet, and a slow, eerie smile crept across his face. "Sometimes," he whispered, "things are forgotten. On purpose." I stood frozen, his words seeping into my brain like a glass of ice water. On purpose, things are forgotten. What could that possibly mean? How could an entire town know, an entire holiday be forgotten on purpose? My head was swimming with questions, but my feet seemed stuck to the floor, too stunned to move. How? How do you know that? I finally managed to say, my voice barely louder than a whisper. But the man didn't lose his smile, only the hard, dead eyes did, which locked with mine and pinned me in place, urging me to turn and run. "There's some things in this world," he said, "that ain't meant to be remembered. Some things that once forgot ought to just stay forgot." He stopped, his eyes darting to the pumpkin. I saw then that it wasn't just any pumpkin, but old, deep cracks running along its surface, almost if it had been rotting for years, although it hadn't fully decayed. There was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl just from looking at it. "What does that mean?" I pressed, my frustration growing. "What are you talking about? Why doesn't anyone remember Halloween?" The man slowly rose from his perch on the bench, the pumpkin at his feet wobbling slightly as he did so. He towered over me then, more menacing than before, though he still didn't seem to be in any hurry. He leaned down just far enough that his face was even with mine, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, spoke, "Some things are better left forgotten. Before they remember you." I stepped backward, my heart racing. "What does that mean?" I yelled out, but the man didn't utter another word. He simply turned and walked away, leaving me to stand there, right in the middle of the park with the old, rotten pumpkin. My mind went racing. Was this some kind of warning? Was Halloween erased on purpose? And what could he possibly mean by before they remember you? A more sinister motive, beyond people simply forgetting a holiday, was lurking in my brain. I kept thinking of the man's words as I looked upon this deserted park. One thing was certain: I had to find answers. I didn't sleep that night. The words of the stranger ran in circles around my head. Some things are better left forgotten, before they remember you. What could that even mean? And why was I the only one left remembering Halloween? I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling as the air in my room seemed heavier than usual, a thick blanket that smothered and pressed down on me. The silence was oppressive, no wind outside, no crickets, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong. I couldn't get the pumpkin out of my head, the ancient look of it, decaying, almost forgotten with the holiday itself. And that man. Who was he? Why did he seem to know what was going on when no one else did? By morning, I knew what I had to do. I needed to know what was going on. I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that there was more to this, something darker. It wasn't just that people had forgotten Halloween. It was almost as if it had been erased. The next day, I went around retracing my steps, asking more questions, knocking on more doors. The responses were always the same: confusion, amusement, blank stares. It was as if Halloween had never existed in the first place. Not even the older folks, whom I certainly thought would remember something, seemed to know anything. But then, as I was walking home that evening, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the street, half concealed in the shadows of an old, dilapidated house, was yet another pumpkin. It looked just like the one that the strange man had, old, cracked, decaying. I felt a chill run down my spine. I approached the house with extreme caution. It was one of those places everyone avoided, the type of house kids dare each other to go near but no one ever does. It had been abandoned since I could recall, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling away like skin. But there, on the front porch, sat the pumpkin. Its flickering glow cast long, eerie shadows across the steps. I had hesitated at the bottom of the porch, every fiber in my body screaming to turn around, to walk away, but I could not. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand why these pumpkins kept appearing and why no one else seemed to see them. I climbed the creaking steps, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, something strange caught my eye. There were carvings on the door, just like those I had seen on the pumpkin. Strange, swirling symbols seemed to pulse in the dim light. I reached out to touch one, and instantly a cold shock ran through me, as if I had touched something alive. Then, it creaked open in an instant. I fell back against the steps, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The house was dark, the air inside heavy and stale. A moment came when I almost turned back, and something placed a strange compulsion upon me, like I was being tugged inside. I stepped across the threshold, the floor groaned beneath my feet. The house reeked of rot and decay, as if it had been abandoned to the mercy of decades gone by. I continued deeper into the hall, my footsteps reverberating against the emptiness. Then I heard a quiet, almost indistinguishable whisper, like the wind, yet more human. It came from farther inside the house. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I kept going, the pounding in my chest growing stronger. The farther I went, the darker it got, until the only light was that coming from outside, the faint glow of the jack-o'-lanterns. It came again, louder this time. Chills ran down my spine. I followed it to the back of the house, down where an old, crumbling staircase led into the basement. The door was cracked open, and from below came the whispering. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves as I padded down the stairs. The farther down I stepped, the colder and louder it got. It wasn't one voice, it was many, a chorus of whispers all tangled together in hushed tones that I couldn't understand. Down below, I was in a small room that was damp and smelled awful. The walls were lined with old, rotting books on shelves. But it wasn't the books that caught my attention, rather, it was an object that sat atop a table in the center of the room. It was another pumpkin. But this one was different. It was larger than the others, its surface smooth and untouched by decay. And carved into its surface were the same curling symbols I had seen on the door. The whispers seemed to be coming from the pumpkin itself, their voices growing louder, more insistent, as I stepped closer. I reached out my hand shaking and touched the surface of the pumpkin. Immediately, the whispers stopped. And in that silence, I heard one clear voice. Soft, almost inaudible, yet unmistakable. Remember. As that word, remember, escaped the air, I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the pumpkin. The whispers ceased and the room fell eerily silent. My heart was racing, and cold sweat began breaking out across my forehead. I was immobile. It felt as if my feet were nailed to the damp floor and my eyes fixed on the glowing surface of the pumpkin. What exactly did that voice mean? Remember what? The house closed in around me, thick with the heavy air of a presence that was indescribable. It felt as if the very shadows were alive, watching me, waiting for something. Never had I felt as though I was so alone, so completely at a disadvantage. But I had to know the truth. I had to know why Halloween disappeared, why nobody remembered, and what that voice meant when saying the word remember. Gaining my courage, I leaned once more toward the pumpkin, my fingers reaching out and shaking. This time, I didn't touch it, I merely stood there waiting, hoping that something would happen, anything. And in response, the symbols on the pumpkin started to glow softly, pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers came back, this time different. Slower. Clearer. Each voice seemed to be speaking right to me, my name called to pull me deeper into the mystery. Why? Don't you remember? One voice whispered. You've forgotten. What they wanted you to forget, another hissed. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just that everybody else had forgotten Halloween, it was about me. I had forgotten something. But what? The symbols on the pumpkin began to shift and swirl, as if alive. Images flickered in my mind, flashes of memories I didn't know. A house with pumpkins, but not as I knew. They were other things, darker, older. A group of figures sitting around a fire, chanting in low, rhythmic tones. Then a figure, a man in a wide-brimmed hat, standing at the edge of firelight, watching. The image shocked me. It was the same man I had seen in the park, the one who told me Halloween was better forgotten. Still, in the vision, he looked different, stronger, more menacing. And he wasn't alone. Others were standing behind him, vague outlines with faces hidden in darkness. Suddenly, the whispers grew loud, overlapping, building into cacophony, every voice speaking at once. You were there, one voice said. You saw it all, another added. I staggered backward, my head spinning. That couldn't be possible. I wasn't there. I didn't know what they were talking about. The more the whispers said, though, the more I felt like something buried deep inside me was stirring, something I had long forgotten. I had to get out of there. I spun and ran up the stairs, feet clattering against the old creaky wood. Whispers came after me, hushed now and fading, as I pushed open the door and ran out onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I gasped for breath. It was a town, quiet and still, oblivious to the strange happenings of that particular house. Still, I knew now there was something underneath it, some presence in that darkness. And I had to figure out exactly what was going on here, and fast. As I hurried home, my head reeled with questions. The voice in the basement, the man in the hat, the strange, shifting symbols, it all tied together somehow. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the things I had seen at all. It was the epiphany that, way down deep, part of me really did remember. I just didn't know how. That night, I barely slept. Pieces of the images kept running around my brain, along with the whispers I'd heard in that house. "You were there," they had said. But how? How could I have been there if I didn't know what there was? By morning, I had decided that whatever was behind it was going to be faced, no matter how terrible. Something had been kept from me, from this town, from anyone. The realization that, in some way, I was involved with it made it urgent. The next several hours I spent in the library, looking through old town records and books of history. I was looking for anything that might refer to Halloween traditions or any other strange happenings in the past. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, though it was just typical small-town history, parades, school festivals, and the occasional fire or flood. Frustration clawed at me. How could I find out what was going on when every lead seemed like a dead end? In an old book on the local folklore, inserted between its 2 pages was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and nearly brittle. There was writing on it. My hands shook as I opened it up. Revealed was a crude map of the town, quite ordinary, as streets and houses are laid out in the same familiar pattern. Then I did find something which wasn't right. And at the center of the map, where a town square should have been, there was an X. Beside it, in shaking handwriting, were the words, "The Forgotten Harvest." A chill ran down my spine. The Forgotten Harvest? I had never heard of such a thing before. But the name sent a ripple of unease through me, like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to see. I tucked the map into my jacket and left the library. My heart was racing. I went out onto the middle of the town square. It was full of people, doing their daily activities with no thought that something was occurring around them. I started to follow the map, my strides lengthening as I came closer to where the spot had been marked with an X. It took me right into the middle of the square, to that old statue of the founder of the town. It had stood in that landscape for as long as I could remember, harmless and a relic of times gone by. Yet, as I finally stood before it, some feeling deep inside said there had to be more to it than what met the eye. I circled the statue, my eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. And then, I saw it near the base of the statue, half concealed beneath the overgrown ivy, was a small, rusted door. It was so well hidden that most would miss it, but now that I knew where to look, as clear as day. I dropped to my knees, fingers shaking as I pushed the ivy aside. The door was ancient, the metal rusted with age, but there was no missing it was to keep something in. Or out. I tugged at the handle, but it didn't move. It was locked. I stood frustrated and began to look around, not knowing exactly what else I was supposed to do. But then, in a strike of clarity, I remembered the weird key I had found in the abandoned house, tucked into the pumpkin's decayed surface. Could it be? I hauled the key from my pocket and fell to my knees once more, ramming it into the lock. My heart was racing as the key slid in, a perfect fit like it had lain there all the time, waiting for this very moment. The door groaned open with a loud scream of rusty hinges. It was the flight of steep stairs leading down to ground level. The air that wafted up was damp, earthy, and decaying dirty, like the odor of the basement in that abandoned house. My stomach churned, but I made myself take a step forward, then another, down into the darkness. The staircase spiraled downward, at least, until it seemed endless. The farther down I went, the coldness in the air seemed to mount. A fog of air breathed out before me while the stone walls closed in and gave the space a claustrophobic feel. But I couldn't turn my back now. I was out to know what lay concealed beneath this town. Finally, I reached the bottom. The staircase opened up into a huge, darkened chamber. At the center of the room, a stone altar, scattered around, on the floor, dozens of old, rotting pumpkins, each one carved with those same swirling symbols I had seen before. As I approached the altar, my heart was racing. The pumpkin seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly glow, casting long, sinister shadows around the room. But what really commanded my attention, however, was the object resting upon the altar itself. It was a book, an ancient, leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn with age. The same swirling symbols were etched into the leather, and the air around it seemed to hum with a strange energy. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the rough surface of the cover. The instant my skin made contact, a wave of images flooded my mind, memories, not just my own, but of others. People in dark robes, gathered around this very altar. Rituals, chants, and the same man in the wide-brimmed hat, standing at the center of it all. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The forgotten harvest. It wasn't a lost tradition, it was a ritual, an ancient, dark ceremony that had been erased from history. And somehow, I'd been part of it. My hand was shaking as I pulled back from the book, my head reeling with the tide of memories that were not my own, yet stirring something deep within. It was almost as if I'd been sucked into a time long past, right into the rituals and ceremonies that had occurred right beneath the town's surface. This wasn't about Halloween, this was much darker. Something deliberately buried, yet somehow, it had resurfaced. And I was at the center of it. I took a step backward, away from the altar, away from the pulsing pumpkins, and the eerie symbols that seemed to shine brighter now. Whispers I had heard before returned, their murmurs louder in my brain, a hum of voices pressing in against me on all sides. You were there. You've forgotten. But we haven't. I clutched my head, trying to drown out the voices. How could I have taken part in such a thing? Never had I seen these people before, never taken part in anything like this weird ritual. But the images, the people in dark robes, the man in the wide-brimmed hat, they were too real to be dreams. Too vivid. I stumbled toward the stairs in my desperation to be out of the chamber, out of the smothering darkness. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me cold. Standing at the base of the stairs, barely visible in the dim light, was the man. The one from the park. The one who had told me Halloween was better left forgotten. He was staring at me from the shadows, his face obscured, but I could tell his eyes were on me, cold and calculating. But he said nothing. He didn't move. He just stood there, blocking my only way out. What is this? I demanded, my voice shaking in both anger and fear. What is going on? Why do I keep seeing these things? It was then that the man stepped forward, the diffused light revealed a paler, more weathered face. The dark eyes were like two endless voids that seemed to drink all the light in. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if each word held within it the weight of centuries. This town, he said in a low, rasping voice, was built on a promise. A pact, made long ago, one the people have forgotten, but one that must be honored. I took a step back. My mind was racing. A pact? What kind of pact? His eyes closed, his voice taking on a razor-sharp intensity. The harvest. It was never supposed to be about costumes and candy. It was older, something holy. But the people forgot over time, and it became a game, a mockery. So it was scrubbed out of their brains so they wouldn't dabble in things they have no business messing with. His words sent shivers down my spine. Scrubbed? How? Why do I remember? Because, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, you were part of it, you were there long ago when the pact was first made. But like everyone else you forgot, till now. My mind reeled, how could that be possible? I wasn't even born when this ritual took place, was I? The images in my head, the flashes of people I didn't know, the strange rituals, it all felt too real. But how could I have been there? He took another step closer to me, and his face was revealed to me now. His skin was pale and tight, etched into a grimace, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. The pumpkins you have seen, they are reminders, markers of what has been forgotten. And they have come back because it's time to remember. I stepped back, shaking my head. I don't get it. Why me? How is this connected to the disappearance of Halloween? His face darkened. Halloween never disappeared. It was taken. Hidden away to protect the town from what's coming. But now, the harvest has been remembered. And so have you. The air in the room took a sudden plunge downward. The pumpkins lining the floor began pulsating faster, casting the room in a sickly unnatural glow. The whispers in my head grew louder, more frantic, as if trying to lead me toward something and something I wasn't ready to hear. I turned to run, but the man's voice stopped me cold. "You can't escape this," he said. "The harvest must be completed. The pact must be honored." And then, I knew. I knew that whatever was happening to me, whatever this town had forgotten, wasn't just about Halloween. It was about something much older. Something darker. And it was coming back. His words echoed in my head: the harvest must be completed. The pact must be honored. In that instant, it felt like the very air between us was now heavy with that promise, forgotten but binding the town and me to something ancient and awful. I felt my legs go numb as fear seeped into my bones. The dim light from the pumpkins danced in the chamber, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. It was all too real now, the images, the whispers, the feeling that I'd been part of something so much older than my memories could reach. My whole childhood love for Halloween had been founded on a lie, or, worse, a truth forgotten, a truth which could be more sinister than I might have ever imagined. "What do you mean I was there?" I exclaimed, shaking, my voice pressed with confusion and desperation. How could I have been a part of something that happened so long ago? The man didn't blink, his eyes stuck in mine, cold. "The pact does not know time as you do," he said with a voice steady as the grave. "You belonged to it once, and now it summons you. The harvest is one of balance. The town took something, and now the town must give in return. That balance must be repaired." I shook my head, taking a step back from him and trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What does that mean? What do I have to do with it?" He stepped closer, all presence dark and suffocating. "You will remember when the time comes. You, as are they, are part of the cycle. But this time, the town must face the truth. No more forgetting. No more hiding behind masks and costumes. This is the true harvest." The pumpkins on the floor pulsed faster, their glow flickering frantically, as if they were feeding off of the tension in the room. It was as though the chamber was alive, the very ground beneath me shifted, awaiting something to happen. He turned from me then, his eyes back to the altar, where the ancient book still lay open. "You cannot stop this," he said, and his voice was softer now, almost regretful. "The town must pay for its forgetting. And so must you." Before I could say a word, the whispering surged again, howling, insistent. The room spun around me and the symbols on the pumpkins melted and reformed, twisting into new shapes. The air grew thick, and my vision began to blur, something deep inside of me stirring, a memory, long buried, clawing its way to the surface. And in an instant, I was somewhere else. The town square. It wasn't the one I knew. Older, darker. The buildings seemed the same, yet something was off with them, as if they had stood, vacant, for centuries. Overhead, the sky was a heavy, diseased gray, the air reeked of rot and spoilage. There, in the square's center, stood a gathering, people, men and women, all of them robed in black, their faces shrouded by cowls. Standing in a circle around a fire, they raised their hands and chanted in those low guttural voices. In the middle, though, was that man in the wide-brimmed hat. He stood tall, his hands resting on the shoulders of a child. A chill went down my spine as I realized it was me. I tried to move and tried to speak, but my body would not respond. I was trapped, watching as the ritual unfolded before me. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, and the fire light in the center of the circle roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the face of each of the hooded figures. The man in the hat leaned down, whispering something into the boy's ear, into my ear, and then he stepped back, raising his hands toward the sky. The chanting was reaching a fever pitch and the flames shot higher, licking at the darkening sky. And then, in an instant, the chanting stopped. Silence fell over the square as the hooded figures lowered their arms sluggishly. The man in the hat turned, his eyes locking onto mine, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition danced in his cold, dark gaze. "Remember," he whispered. The flames died, the square faded, and I was back in the chamber, gasping for breath, the whispers disappearing into the distance. I stumbled backwards, clutching my head as the memory crashed over me like a wave. It was real. I had been there. But how? How could I have been part of that ritual, that harvest? And why had I forgotten? He was still standing at the altar, his eyes heavy with the weight of centuries. "You see now," he said softly. "You've always been part of this. The pact binds you, just as it binds the town. You cannot escape it." Terror seized me. The weight of the forgotten harvest, the memory of that dark ritual, the knowledge that I'd been part of something far older and darker than I could comprehend, it was too much. I need to get out. I needed to flee. I whirled and fled, my feet pounding against the cold stone floor as I ran up the stairs. Behind me, the whispers followed me, growing louder, more frantic, like they knew I was trying to get away. "You cannot escape this. You will remember." I burst through the door and out into the square, the cool air hitting me like a slap. But even as I ran, I knew that wasn't the end. The harvest was still to come. And this time, no one would be allowed to forget. I sprinted through the quiet streets of the town as my breath came in sharp gasps, my racing mind fitting together everything I had just seen, the vision and the ritual, and the man, all connected, yet nothing coming near to complete the puzzle. Night was falling rapidly, and an eerie calm that had blanketed the town all day now shifted into something darker and more sinister. Halloween hadn't gone anywhere, and neither had the feast. It had been ripped from our grasp, buried in layers of memory and time, until it scratched itself back. I sprinted to my house, the picture of my porch barely registering in my mind. I was shaking all over, fumbling with the key, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind me. The house was quiet, too quiet. Mom and Dad weren't home, and for once, the stillness was overwhelming. I sank down onto the living room floor, hugging my head in my hands. The whispers from the chamber still echoed in my mind, tangling themselves around snippets of the vision I'd had. The boy in the center of the ritual, the man in the wide-brimmed hat, the fire, it was all too much. But a part of me knew that it wasn't over. I had to remember. I had to piece together what had been stolen from me, from the town, from Halloween itself. But the harder I concentrated, the more those memories slipped through my grasp like sand. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I heard something, a faint rhythmic tapping that arose from without. My heart leapt into my throat, and I rose deliberately to my feet. I moved to the window. The street outside was deserted, bathed by the pale light of the street lamps. There, however, upon my front porch was a singular, solitary pumpkin. It was old and cracked and decaying, like all of the others I'd found. But this one was different. This one had my name carved onto its surface. A wave of cold terror washed over me as I stared at the pumpkin. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a deep, gnawing dread settle in my chest. The harvest wasn't coming. It was already here. I retreated from the window as my heart beat loudly in my ears. The room felt so much smaller now, the walls seemed closing in on me. I needed answers, but to whom was I to turn? The man in the park, the chamber beneath the square, the whispers, they all were leading me here, to this moment. But why? What was I to do? Then, suddenly, the front door let out a creak and swung open. I spun about, but by now my pulse was racing, and the hall was empty. The door stood ajar, dancing in the breeze. And leaning in the doorway, hat rakishly on head, was the man in the wide-brimmed hat. First, he said nothing. He merely stood there, his shadow sprawling across the floor like some dark stain. His presence filled the room heavy and oppressive. I felt the usual weight of fear settle inside my chest. "It's time," he said, his voice low and cold. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. "Time for what?" He stepped inside, his eyes gleaming with a dark intensity. "The harvest. The pact must be honored. You've remembered enough to know that." I shook my head, backing away from him. "No. I don't understand." "Why me? What does this have to do with me?" His expression didn't shift. "You were chosen, long ago. You and the others. But they forgot. You forgot. And now, the harvest shall take what's owed." I stumbled back, my mind racing. "But I don't. I don't want to be part of this. I didn't ask for any of this." The man's eyes went dark. "It doesn't matter. The pact was made. It cannot be broken." My chest surged with a sudden panic, and the room circled around me in some maddening dance. I tried to make sense of it all, but it was a jumbled mess. I hadn't chosen this. I hadn't agreed to be some sacrifice to an ancient ritual. Yet, here it was. It was happening. It was real. And then, in a flash of clarity, I remembered. The ritual. The fire. The man in the hat. I'd been there, stood central in that circle as if in some vision. Yet I was not alone. There were others, those children standing beside me, their faces blurred by time. We were chosen. We were part of the harvest. But something had gone wrong. I didn't know how or why, but the ritual had been disrupted, the pact broken, and the town forgotten. Halloween was erased, buried under layers of forgotten history, and now it was returning, demanding what had been lost. The man took another step closer towards me, his voice soft but commanding. "You cannot run from this. The harvest will take what it is owed." I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding. "What? What does it want?" The man's eyes gleamed. "It wants you." It was as if the room closed in on me, the air thick with the weight of his words. I could hear the whispers once again, louder this time, a cacophony in my mind full of their insistent, haunting voices. The pumpkins, the rituals, the pact, it all boiled down to this. But there was no way out. No escape. Suddenly, this man's shadow loomed over me, dark and suffocating. His cold, lifeless eyes had dug into my own while he reached out, stretching his hand toward me like a claw. "You are the harvest," he whispered. "You always were." And just as his hand was about to touch me, I woke up. Early morning light filled the room. A faint hum of life outside stirred in through the window. My heart was still racing, my skin cold with sweat. But I was in my bed. Safe. I sat up, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of it all. The harvest, the pact, the man in the hat, it had all felt so real. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. It was just a dream. A nightmare. I stumbled out of bed, disoriented still, and rushed to the window. The street outside was teeming with life, kids running around in their costumes, jack-o'-lanterns glowing on porches, houses decorated with all of the familiar trappings of Halloween. It was back. Halloween hadn't disappeared after all. Relief washed over me, yet there was something darker lacing it, a nagging unease that would just not quit. The dream had felt so real, so alive. The man in the hat, the whispers, the ancient pact. It was still all there, burrowed deep in my mind. I hurriedly got dressed and went downstairs. All the familiar sights and sounds of Halloween surrounded me as it did every year. Mom and Dad were already fixing up the decorations. Nothing was out of the ordinary. And yet, before joining the festivities outdoors, I had glanced back at the porch. There, tucked away in the corner, was a small pumpkin. Perfectly carved. And etched into its surface, in tiny, swirling letters, was a single word. Remember.